Welcome to the Brainbox Podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings the scholarship of the humanities disciplines to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of current events. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics, who give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural contexts of world events. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and that website, and you can also email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. In this episode, we'll be talking about the 1960s. We're now half a century away from the end of the 1960s, an era that in many ways still defines American life and culture. In 2019, we're 50 years on from the moon landing, the Woodstock Festival, the Stonewall Riot, the Manson family murders, and the final album the Beatles recorded together. Why do the 1960s continue to loom so large in our culture? How has our cultural memory of the 60s distorted the actual events of that decade and the meanings that we've taken from them? Even if it is said that if you can remember the 60s, you weren't really there. What were the 1960s, and how should we remember them today? Our guest is Dr. Ben Alpers, a professor of American Intellectual and Cultural History at the University of Oklahoma's Honors College. Ben is also a member of the Oklahoma Humanities Board of Trustees, and he's a great advocate for the importance of the humanities in our state and across the nation. Ben is a true GFOP, a great friend of the pod. He was actually the very first guest on our first episode of Brainbox about a year ago when we talked about Watergate. So welcome back, Ben.
Thank you.
There are a lot of ways to define the 60s beyond just the exact chronological dates. The one conception I really like defines them as the 60s started with I Want to Hold Your Hand and they ended with Helter Skelter. Or some people would say the 60s started with the Kennedy assassination and ended with Watergate. How do you like to define the 60s?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, in a way, we think of decades as very much defining the way historical time is divided up. But of course, there's something kind of artificial about that. I mean, why should a year ending in 0 define the beginning of something, right? So historians all the time, though we talk about the 60s and the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, it rarely begins in, the beginning of the chronological decade and ends at the end of it. And the 60s is a really interesting case in point because there are various versions, as you said, of short 60s and long 60s. 60s that extend into the 1970s, or 60s that begin usually into the 1960s, in fact. The thing I think of when I think about the 60s, and I think this is really kind of important when thinking about them, is they're a decade that people started thinking of as the 60s, even at the time. So that in 1970, there's a sense that this very important decade is coming to an end. And there are a number of important public intellectuals, people like Joan Didion, who are kind of reflecting back on the 60s in 1970. And there are reasons why, even as the 70s were chronologically beginning, people have a sense that something has come to an end. And you mentioned some of them, in fact. Things like the Manson murders are seen as representing sort of the curdling of a whole series of dreams and hopes that people associated with the 1960s. So I tend to, part because I'm working on the 70s, and I see the 70s as beginning in 1970 for a variety of reasons. I tend to see a sort of short 1960s. I think it's hard to draw kind of hard lines here. But I do think the Kennedy assassination is very important as a beginning point. When we think of the 60s, in a way, the center of it is things like the Summer of Love in 1967, things like the anti-Vietnam War movement that really gets going after the middle of the chronological 1960s, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They're all right there in that period. Of course, there's this other 1960s as well, a period that I think really came to our attention in memory with Mad Men, which is a show that's, in a sense, very much about the 60s, but that starts very much in that kind of pre-1960s of the early 1960s.
Kind of a hangover from the 50s.
Exactly. And I think, in a way, the early seasons of that show were kind of playing off the way that when we think of the 60s in memory, we don't, at least before then, think of that world as being the 60s. And the characters at the first season of Mad Men are very aware of the fact that the 1960s is beginning, right? But they don't know what that means yet, in a sense, right? When I've taught the 60s, I occasionally teach a course on American politics and culture in the 60s at the OU Honors College. I'll often start with the film The Apartment, which is an early 1960s movie, which is very much in that world. And it's a world that doesn't look like what we think of as the 1960s, but that is raising some of these questions we do think of in connection with the 60s, questions about sexuality and gender and so on. So in a way, I tend to think of a short 60s, but I also think they're kind of many 60s. And it's the nature of historical memory, too, that our vision of a decade will change over time and different things. There's a cliche that historians of each generation have to write a new history of the past. And I think that's true in just historical memory, too, that we remember different things about past periods. And the 60s is not that long ago. And it's very much a moving target still, I think.
When I was researching this episode, I ran across an essay about the impact of the 60s by a pop culture columnist for the Washington Post named Hank Stiver, I think. I think he's actually a native of Oklahoma. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And he wrote this. I'm curious what you think about this. He writes, "My generation and every generation after it received a steady dose of the 1960s, beginning in 1970. Even now, babies in car seats are lulled by the Beatles playlist. When it comes to other decades, we mostly make fun of them and play dress up. We do that with the 60s too, but we also hold the 60s in an entirely higher regard. The 60s are irresistible to us in every category that matters, in leadership, movements, social awakenings, acts of rebellion, and in fashion, song, and spirit. It seems like the 60s really were a time of extreme turmoil, riots, assassinations, the Vietnam War, anti-war protest movement. There are these iconic pop cultural movements, the Beatles, humans walked on the moon at the end of the decade. So when you study the 60s, does it really stand out as a uniquely pivotal decade, pivotal dramatic time period?
Well, I think the sense of the 60s as a pivotal decade is absolutely there. I was going to ask you, when was that excerpt written?
It was written around the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination.
Interesting.
Actually.
Yeah. Because I think what he describes there, I think of as a very kind of Gen X. As a Gen Xer myself.
Me too.
A very sort of Gen X experience. I grew up in Berkeley, California in the 1970s. And much of my childhood was spent feeling like I just missed this party.
Yeah.
Right? That there was this huge series of events that went on, basically before I was born in 1965. So I was around for them, but I wasn't really aware of them. I was a little tiny kid. And by the time I reached, junior high school and high school, it seemed like, all of this stuff that was going on, that was exciting and happening just right outside my door wasn't going on anymore. Right? And I think of the very first academic history of the 1970s has the title, It Seemed Like Nothing Happened.
When was that written?
That was written in the 80s.
Okay.
And I think what's interesting about that is I do think that was sort of the 70s perspective to a very great extent on the 70s, right? That there was this decade in which the 60s, all of these things were going on, culturally, socially, politically. And then the 70s just felt like a decade of stagnation, malaise, the famous Jimmy Carter speech. He never actually uses the word malaise in it, but it's known as the malaise speech. And there's a way in which that's the way the 70s gets experienced in the 70s. The irony is that in the last decade or so, maybe the last 2 decades now, historians actually have come more and more to see the 70s as the really great watershed decade in a lot of ways in American life, as the kind of place where the America of today is really born in a lot of ways. But absolutely, the 60s had that feel about them even in the 70s. And I think culturally, it continues to have that kind of weight. And not for bad reasons either. I mean, it is a decade of enormous, significant changes that we're still feeling today.
That reminds me of the film dazed and confused from the 90s about the 70s. When they talk about the 60s being awesome, the kids in the 70s are talking about how awesome the 70s are. No, sorry. The kids in the 70s are talking about how awesome the 60s are, and they're talking about how boring the 70s are. And the 80s are going to be awesome. Every other decade, every opposite decade is awesome. Anyway,
Yeah.
Another thing I read when I was preparing for this episode was, this is a quote that really stuck with me about our parents' generation, maybe Ben, the baby boomers. It described them as, I'm going to use air quotes, chronically self-celebratory. Chronically self-celebratory. So, do you think the 60s loom larger than other decades because of the oversized impact of the baby boom generation? These were their glory days?
That's a really interesting question. I am the child of silent generation people, right? Who don't have that reputation, and for sort of good reason. My parents were a little older. And I do think, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating, and this is sort of I guess another issue, but related, as you say, is the status of the baby boomers in American life is going through rapid changes. And I think the baby boomers are now viewed, not entirely for bad reasons, very negatively, right? And somehow I don't think that's necessarily that vision of the baby boomers, the sort of notion that this was in, I don't know if you saw this most recent Saturday Night Live.
I did see
this
that.
skit, right? Yeah. So this notion that the baby boomers are sort of like the copper thieves of American life, right? They come in and sort of like strip us and like leave nothing, particularly for the millennials, right?
Yeah.
Somehow that image of the baby boomers, which has a certain basis in reality, I mean, like all these things, it's a bit of a stereotype. I don't think that's entirely affected our image of the 60s, oddly enough. But obviously, the 60s are the decade where the baby boomers kind of first come of age. That youth culture is a baby boomer culture, if we want to put it that way. I mean, I think part of the problem here is that there are real limits to what generational thought gets us. I mean, talking about baby boomers, Gen X, greatest generation, millennials, there's something there. But I think that getting sort of too caught up in that, you end up losing a lot of important details. And the 60s, of course, if the kids in the summer of love are the baby boomers, there are plenty of people who aren't baby boomers who are having profound impact on the 60s, right? I mean, Martin Luther King was not a baby boomer.
Timothy Leary, not a baby boomer.
Exactly. So the baby boomers are important, but they're obviously not the whole picture.
Speaking of kind of the stereotypes of the 60s, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 72, so my cultural memories kind of began in the late 70s, early 80s. My parents were baby boomers. So somewhere along the way, I picked up this stereotypical idea of the 60s. I kind of imagine, I still sort of do in some ways, that everybody was running around in tie-dyes and love beads and practicing free love and marching in street protests every weekend. I mentioned this to my mother-in-law, who's from Oklahoma, and she said, no, not in Oklahoma. They weren't. Are these stereotypes unique to the 60s? Are they just an extreme example that we grasp onto? Or do you think we do that with other eras
I
as
think
well?
With other decades. Oddly, the 50s are a decade where we do that too, right? The sort of sense of the 50s as this decade of conformity and so on. And of course, there is that, but it's also the cradle of the modern civil rights movement is the 1950s, right? And so that's conflict, right? That's real social conflict. That's not stasis and conformity. So I do think we sometimes do this with decades, and we certainly have done it with the 60s. And again, it doesn't take very long to look underneath the surface and see that everyone wasn't like that, because of course there was tremendous cultural conflict over things like drug use and what music you listen to and who is and isn't a hippie and so on, right? I mean, in a way, whether we see it as the long 60s or the beginning of the 70s, the politics of the first Nixon term, the idea of a silent majority, right? That's all built on this kind of sense that everyone isn't like that. Right. To take an Oklahoma example, the song Okie from Muskogee is in fact all about those people.
Right.
And the irony of that song, as everyone always points out, is that it was written ironically and then it becomes a hit. Seriously. And so no, everyone isn't like that. And I think that at some level, I mean, that defines the decade, that everyone isn't like that. It's a lot of conflict over those things.
I'm interested in how these distorted stereotypes have maybe been used for political purposes in the decades since, being able to demonize hippies and the permissiveness of the free love era, or even the overreach of LBJ's Great Society programs. What about these distortions of the 60s in future decades?
Well, the 60s become very much, and the 50s too, actually, become kind of touchstones in American politics, particularly starting, I think, in the 1980s, where if you look at kind of the symbolism of American conservatism in the 1980s, a lot of it is kind of run against the 60s. And that has a lot to do, actually, with the fact that Reagan dominates that, and Reagan builds his political career in California running against the 60s, in effect. That's very much sort of the feel of his 2 terms as governor of California, which is going on right in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I think that kind of, the contrast between these kind of 2 visions of America are very important politically, in the decades afterwards. So yeah, I think there's a kind of political dimension to this, absolutely.
How did he run against the 60s?
In California, he promised, he said, I've had enough of these sit-ins and teach-ins. When I get elected, I'm gonna have a throwout. I mean, basically, he sort of runs against Berkeley, very much, when he first runs for governor. So that's, I think, an important kind of theme in American conservative politics after the 1960s. And Nixon obviously picks up on this too. That's the sort of silent majority thing. The cultural politics of that extend well into the next few decades and have a profound impact on the way the 60s are seen, right? And so then that stereotype ends up taking on a life of its own. So to take an example that seems far from politics, a film like Forrest Gump, which is not my favorite film, plays off of, and in fact embraces, the stereotypical vision of the 60s, right? Was Forrest's girlfriend who ends up as a hippie and dies because she's a hippie, essentially, right?
Death by hippie.
Death by 60s. And essentially Forrest survives by not being like that, right? And so, yeah, I think these stereotypes are important and are kind of made more so by our politics.
At Oklahoma Humanities, we're providing funding and resources that support lifelong learning and a vibrant cultural life for all Oklahomans. Our mission is to strengthen communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. Check out our online calendar of events at okhumanities.org/calendar for a full listing of our programs and humanities events we sponsor all across the state. Maybe one of the misconceptions about the way we recall the 60s is to conflate student radicalism with hippies.
Yeah.
We've talked about this a little bit. What's the story here?
The story here is that there were actually very different groups of people. The counterculture on the one hand and the New Left on the other. And we tend to sort of equate them, and they're places where they meet. I mean, most famously in a figure like Abby Hoffman and the Yippies. But that's a very self-conscious attempt to try to bring these worlds together, to sort of bring the cultural radicalism of the counterculture together with the political radicalism of the New Left. In fact, for most of the 60s, these are 2 groups rather at odds with each other. The sort of hippie vision of kind of, tuning in, tuning on, dropping out is very different from a vision of trying to sort of transform the world through political action. And by the time you get to the end of the decade, and Hoffman and the Yippies are a good example of this, there are a number of people on sort of both sides of that fence who are trying to bridge that gap, who see these are both kind of attempts by a younger generation to assert themselves, and maybe if they could sort of talk to each other. But it attracts rather different people. Like in the Bay Area, this is often, I grew up in the Bay Area, is often almost seen as a geographical division between San Francisco, which is very much seen as the sort of center of the counterculture, and Berkeley across the Bay, which is very much sort of the center of the New Left, and in a way the kind of one of the fonts of the New Left, right? The free speech movement of 1964. And these are sort of related to each other, but they're going on they're separate from each other too. And so the way that they interact is very complicated. And then the way that plays out later in the decade is complicated too. When you get to the 70s, we're obviously in this state now confronting medical marijuana. And there's a lot of very interesting work being done now on the history of marijuana for these, not just because of our state, obviously a lot of other states too, but there's a very interesting Netflix documentary series called Murder Mountain. I know if you've seen it, about Humboldt County in California, which is, 60% of all marijuana grown in the United States is grown in Humboldt County, something like that. And one of the interesting things about it mainly takes place in recent years, but it kind of goes back into the history of Humboldt County. And the reason why Humboldt County became a center for pot cultivation is a bunch of hippies moved there in the 70s just to kind of get away, to live a simpler life. And they originally grow pot just because they use pot, and they're growing their own food and they're growing their own pot. And then they suddenly discover that this is a way to make money. And so it kind of flows out of that. But it's very much this kind of what I think of as the kind of hippie desire to kind of drop off the grid. And that's a very different desire, right, from a desire to kind of positively transform the world around you, right, sort of SDS, right, and in a way,
SDS is the
Students for a Democratic Society, right, which gets more and more radical over the course of the 1960s. Starts with the Port Huron Statement in the early 1960s. Is a very central organization in the anti-war movement, and then after the end of the 1960s falls apart at the end of the decade. And among the things that come out of it are the Weather Underground and the kind of new communist movements of the 1970s, which are much, much smaller and much more politically radical, but also very different. So, the hippies growing pot in Humboldt County are very different from, weathermen accidentally blowing up their apartment in New York with bombs, right? And I don't want to reduce either of these sets to either of those stereotypes, because these are just examples of it. But these are obviously very different sorts of people in each of these groups. And yet somehow when we kind of look back on the 60s, you're right, there's often a conflation of hippies equals anti-war movement equals new left. And that's really not quite right. And it has a lot to do with generational politics, right? Because that is, the core of both those groups is a generation of these young baby boomers. Though again, both of those groups, you mentioned Timothy Leary, he's older, very much involved in the counterculture, and they're older people involved in the new left too, who though both of these movements, if we want to call them movements, are dominated by young people, and that's one of the reasons why we sort of think of them together.
I'm so interested in the stereotypical conceptions of an era and the stereotypes of hippies. Like as you mentioned, these entrepreneurial hippies growing pot and selling it in larger amounts. It kind of gets to the stereotype of the grown-up hippies in the 80s who become yuppies and become super materialistic.
And this is the 70s when this is going on. So again, this hits our stereotypes. Of course, the person who's most stereotypically that way is Jerry Rubin, who along with Abby Hoffman was one of the founders of the Yippies, and becomes I think a Wall Street stockbroker in the 1970s, right? And there's, there are those famous individual examples, but then there I think more consequential trips like that. And someone like Stuart Brandt, I think is his name, who's a really key figure in the early days of Silicon Valley, and who comes out of a sort of countercultural ecological consciousness in the 1970s, and then ends up being very involved in sort of creating the world we all live in now. And there are people, Stanford, not surprisingly, is home to a number of historians who work on that transformation, where Silicon Valley comes from, and the connections between various bits of what we think of as the 1960s and the world of Apple and, and Google and so on that, we're living in today. So yeah, those transformations are really interesting and important.
Is it, it feels like it's probably a vast oversimplification to say this, but a lot of things that you've said made me think that the overall theme is sort of a loss of innocence. Maybe we looked at but we probably weren't so innocent in the
America,
late 50s, early 60s.
This is, I don't know if other countries do this, but America's constantly losing its innocence. One of the jokes historians often joke about this: America's lost its innocence more times. I don't know if you're certainly old enough to remember the movie Quiz Show, about the quiz show scandals. That's America.
When we lost our innocence.
We lost our innocence there. We lost our innocence. The McCarthy hearing. So we were losing
Altamont.
Altamont. We lost. We are constantly losing our innocence.
Where did I put my innocence?
The more interesting question is how we keep getting our innocence back to lose it every few years. But yeah, I think a lot of the narrative we have of the 60s is a narrative of the loss of innocence. And Altamont, again, this is a short 60s argument, right? Altamont is at the end of the chronological 60s as well.
Just a few months after Woodstock.
Exactly. Right? And it very much is seen as that kind of curdling of the 60s, right?
How do your college students think about the 60s these days? Is it still kind of mythologized, idealized, or does it not loom as large for them?
I think that's been a change in the time. I came to OU in 1998, and I think that it looms less large, or rather, there are other decades that now loom similarly large, I guess is the way I'd put it. And it's been a few years since I've taught my 60s colloquium. So things change very fast in terms of generations of students. So I don't know about students right now, but over the course of the 5 or 7 years that I taught that course, I saw real changes in terms of students' relationships to it. And I've more recently taught courses on the 1970s. And that now, for this generation of students is a very long time ago.
God, that hurts me.
Part of it too is that historical time is not, again, this goes back to chronological decades. It doesn't happen evenly, right? And one of the things about the 60s that is quite unusual is it is one of these historical moments that is a real kind of moment of profound and fast change. World War II is a bit like that too, right? And a great cultural marker of that is the film American Graffiti, right? Which comes out in 1973, okay, and is a surprise hit. The studio doesn't really think it's going to work, they think the title doesn't make any sense. It sounds like an Italian film. Whatever, okay. But it's a huge hit. And it's sold as a nostalgia piece, which it very much is. But it takes place in 1962. So it is nostalgia for 11 years ago. But in 1973, 1962 is another world away. I mean, that really, however you define the 60s, they happen in there, right? And so this film, which is very it's George Lucas's second movie, a director who's, I think, since become a little better known.
I've heard of him.
And he wouldn't have been able to make Star Wars had this film not been as big a hit as it was, but it's autobiographical. It's set in 62 in part because that was his senior year in high school in Modesto. But the problems that the kids in this film are facing, part of the effect of the film is they're going to be facing this whole set of problems they can't even imagine, right? And this is a film that I think creates or at least popularizes this way of concluding the film, which ends with a title crawl telling you what happens to all the characters.
Yeah.
And basically all of their lives are disrupted by the Vietnam War. Some of them are killed in Vietnam. One of them is a journalist in Canada, and what that means is he was a draft dodger, right? So, and over the course of the film, Vietnam's never mentioned because in summer of 1962 in Modesto, California, Vietnam's not an issue, right? But it soon will be, and it'll dominate these characters' lives. And everybody watching the film understands this. And these are characters who just graduated with high school, and they think they know the world they're getting into. And the power of that movie, to a certain extent, one of the powers of that movie is the world they're getting into is something they can't even imagine. And even 11 years later, and American Graffiti is not alone this way. The musical Grease, which is 1969, I think, is when it begins on Broadway. Maybe 1970. It also is set, I think, in 61. So it's another one of these things where you have like a decade, which seems like this vast gulf of time, and vast enough that it's sort of culturally interesting, and the source of sort of popular depictions.
Yeah, it's hard for us to imagine a huge hit musical coming out today about something that happened in 2010.
Exactly. Yeah.
there's a compression of. There's a really interesting idea about there used to be maybe a sense that nostalgia happens in 20-year waves. Like when I grew up in the 80s, the 60s we were very nostalgic about the 60s, but I've read an argument that it's the effect of YouTube has made we can be nostalgic about any era all at the same time because it's all available to us. But do you think there is a compression of American nostalgia? Or
it's an interesting question. I mean, the 70s, one of the things that defines the 70s is even at the time it's seen as a decade that is dominated by nostalgia and not and largely not for the 60s, but for the America before the 1960s. In fact, I'm working on this right now.
Yeah, I want to talk about that.
But, you think about the 50s and the 70s, Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley. American Graffiti, which though it takes place in the early 60s, is kind of a 50s movie in a certain way. Or The Waltons, which takes place in the Great Depression, right? Yeah. There's always nostalgia in American life. That's not new, obviously, in the 1970s. But there's a kind of a sense in the 70s, fairly or not, of an intensification of nostalgia. And again, this is something that's noted very early in the 1970s. One of the first issues of National Lampoon, something which starts in the 1970s, is the nostalgia issue. So they're kind of making fun of this in like 1970 or 71. So, and partly again, that's the rapid changes of the 1960s. But how nostalgia happens, why nostalgia happens, I think is incredibly difficult to really put your finger on. And some of it's, of course, marketing, because what nostalgia means for content producers, if I can put it that way, is it's a simple way to hook viewers in. If you know that people are going to be interested in the 1950s, right? I mean, to get back to Happy Days, one of the reasons why Happy Days goes from being essentially a pilot to a regular show is the success of American Graffiti, which convinces some people that this idea of having a show based in the 1950s might have legs and people might actually want to might want to watch it. And so I do think that some of it is marketing. And there's a interesting and I think wrong, and I actually think this about a lot of things this guy wrote, piece by Christopher Lasch in Harper's in the early 1980s, arguing that all the sense that the 70s is dominated by nostalgia is just imagined. And this is just like, basically pundits creating this. And I actually think he's wrong about this, but I do think that nostalgia itself kind of just becomes sort of a topic of discussion unmoored from what people are actually interested in or watching. Sometimes.
I was going to mention the sort of on the topic of the pop cultural influence of the 60s that I saw it firsthand when I was giving out Halloween candy. There were still kids dressing up as hippies, like 1960s hippies, but my daughter dressed up as a 1980s dancer. So there was this weird, it was a weird wave of multiple waves of nostalgia. Anyway, I mean, the pop cultural influence of the 60s, maybe we felt it more as Generation Xers, but in the 80s, I mean, the Beatles were huge. Led Zeppelin was huge. Jimi Hendrix was huge. We wore tie-dyes. Anyway, I'd love to talk about your study of the 70s, too. Can you talk about the book that you're currently working on?
Sure, yeah. It's tentatively titled Happy Days.
Good title.
And it's about Americans in the 1970s essentially trying to process the 60s by thinking about the American past before the 60s. So there's a chapter on 50s nostalgia. There's a chapter on the figure of the hard-boiled PI in neo-noir movies. There's a chapter in the bicentennial, which of course is a big moment of this kind of thing. And then the last chapter is about Alex Haley's roots and also Octavia Butler's Kindred and kind of different ways of sort of understanding the African-American past and relating it to the African-American present.
Well, we'll put some information about your writings and that book on our website for this episode as well. Do you have any favorite books about the 60s or historical resources about the 60s that you might recommend?
Oh gosh. Interesting question.
Or some that you would not recommend. So any that are distorted or...
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'll put it this way. When I teach the 60s, I do a lot of work with primary documents, movies, music, so on, in part because I think, and as you said, all these things are very accessible to us now. And I think exploring the documents at the time is a very great way to know about it. Beyond that, there aren't any, like, at least I don't think there are any completely compelling, comprehensive histories of the 1960s. They're I wish I'd come more prepared to answer this question.
Okay.
Tell you what, I will put some on the webpage.
Okay, great.
Because there are some very good books on particular topics and actually on particular years, interestingly enough, in the 1960s.
Okay.
I'm not coming up with chapter and verse. This is what being a middle-aged Gen Xer is about. But I'll provide some for our listeners, on the webpage.
Do you have any particular favorite, I'll say maybe cultural icons of the 60s? Do you still listen to the Beatles, or are there 60s films that are still resonant for you?
Yeah, lots of these things. I mean, when I was a kid, I was an enormous Beatles fan. And I do occasionally listen to the Beatles, but that's almost music like I don't even need to listen to it anymore, right?
It's just
kind of in me.
Right.
But there's all kinds of 60s music I listen to, from, John Coltrane, if we want to count that as 60s music. I certainly would consider that 60s music. To, you mentioned Led Zeppelin, absolutely worth listening to. James Brown. I mean, it's an incredibly, musically rich decade. And in film, it's a moment of real transformation in Hollywood, where at the very end of the decade, you get this kind of emergence of what gets called, the new Hollywood. And in a certain way, the 70s are a more interesting decade of American film than the 60s are, though the 60s have, world cinema. There are all kinds of things going on. There's a flowering of Czech cinema, in the late 1960s, just before the Prague Spring, obviously, films like Daisies and so on. But 60s films that matter to me, Rosemary's Baby, Nothing But a Man, which is a very important African-American movie from the early 1960s. Other 60s films. 2001, an interesting and important 1960s movie. Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde. There are a lot of terrific and interesting films of the decade. Though, again, I would say, just sort of purely from the point of view of Hollywood cinema, and I think most film scholars, film buffs would agree with this, the 70s is in many ways a richer decade. The 60s is a decade where, to a very great extent, and there's actually a good book about this by a guy named Mark Harris called, I think it's called 5 Movies of the Revolution. I might have that wrong, about the 5 Oscar nominees in 1968. That is the 5 films from 1967 that are nominated for Best Picture. And one of the arguments of the book is, and I think it's really right, is that Hollywood, which is still dominated by the folks who kind of dominated Hollywood in the earlier decades, has no idea what to do with this new audience and these cultural changes. And it gets kind of surprised at the end of the decade by the success of films like The Graduate, Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, which are not the films they're investing money in films like Dr. Dolittle, which is, they basically, Sound of Music makes a lot of money. And so Hollywood thinks musicals, and they're dead wrong. And so they make a bunch of very expensive musicals that don't really find an audience. And what does find an audience are films that from their perspective seem sort of weird, like Bonnie and Clyde, like The Graduate, though Mike Nichols is a guy who, as a director, had kind of established himself already to a certain extent.
Easy Rider, maybe.
Easy Rider, too, which is even more of an outsider film. And the result is that when you get to the early 70s, Hollywood is in the mood to sort of throw money at young folks right out of film school. People like Francis Ford Coppola. People like George Lucas, whose first film, THX 1138, is a really weird kind of art house sci-fi film. And in fact, at the time that American Graffiti, which is the second film which I mentioned, is made, he's seen as a kind of rising art director, which is the weirdest thing in the world to sort of think of George Lucas in those terms, because obviously that's not kind of the way he actually establishes himself later on in American culture. But the early 70s is a moment when Hollywood is investing money in people like George Lucas, precisely because over the course of much of the 1960s, they're losing a lot of money making big, expensive movies that people don't particularly want to see. And that's a measure of these cultural changes as well. But again, the long-winded answer to your question, that's one of the reasons why it's a kind of complicated decade for movies. So there are things in the early 60s too. The Apartment, which I mentioned, is a wonderful movie, Billy Wilder movie.
Is that Jack Lemmon?
Yeah. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is famous as the movie which in a sense finally kills off the production code because it has the F word on screen.
Oh, okay.
And that's the moment where they sort of decide we've got to come up with some other way of dealing with this. And so that's when they come up with the rating system. So I guess this is another way in which the world we live in today is a product. I mean, we're now used to movie ratings, but basically throughout American history, Hollywood made movies up until that point with this sort of idea that every movie should be viewable by every conceivable member of the audience. And other countries are different. The UK has had a rating system since the first decade of the 20th century. But America doesn't decide to divide movies by age until 1968. That's when the rating system comes in.
68.
And it's a result of these changes. Basically, the old production code, for a variety of reasons, it collapses. But the thing that finally kills it off is this kind of cultural change, where they're just things that you're not allowed to do in movies that people start doing, and that the system lacks teeth to a certain extent. And the guy, incidentally, who makes those changes as head of the organization, the MPAA, that's responsible for it is Jack Valenti, who's a LBJ aide who comes out of Texas politics and then goes and sort of remakes the movie rating system in the 1960s. So,
I have a question. I don't know if this is a horrible question to ask a historian, but I'm just to kind of wrap it up. What are the maybe historical lessons of the 1960s that would serve us well to remember properly today, wiping away all the distorted stereotypes about the 60s? Can you identify any lessons that we might take?
Oh, I'm not. I think there's lots we can learn from history. I think most historians, I'm sort of averse to sort of say lessons of the 60s. But I will say this, that in the last few years, there have been, particularly last year because it was the 50th anniversary, a lot of comparisons with 1968. A year which is in a lot of people's minds associated with crisis, for good reason. Bobby Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, Tet Offensive, the Prague Spring, and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. What's important to remember about 68, I think, and in the 60s in general, is one of the reasons why that year felt like such a crisis is there were so many hopes there too. And I think that sense of hope and the kind of utopian aspect of the 60s, sometimes when we look at, there are lots of lessons people draw from the 60s, but when we look at it as a sort of period of crisis and clash and so on and division, which in certain ways it is, we can sometimes lose track of the, in a positive sense, visionary side of the 60s, and we were talking about the baby boomers, and I think in a way, that may get lost in our baby boomer conversations. That is, to the extent that the baby boomers become seen as kind of the generation of narcissists, which is kind of where we're heading now. That will, I think, push us to forget that there's real political, social, cultural vision that's coming out of that generation in the late 1960s. And it's a response to a sense on their part of the stagnation of the 50s. I'm putting air quotes on that because I don't think it's fair to stereotype the 50s that way either. But sometimes I think, and it isn't always the case, that the vision of the 60s, and this is Forrest Gump again, as a period of sort of disaster, excess, so on, loses a lot of the positive things of that decade, that moment in that decade. And if you end up, to get back to the Manson killings, if that ends up being your sort of, the punchline of the decade, that's a very, very dark thing, obviously. And I guess I think it's important to see it's not at all just that, that there really are positive things to be taken from it and positive ideas. And certainly we're still listening to the music, and still impacted in positive ways by those cultural changes. And I think there's sort of some political hopes too, that particularly now actually that the millennials are kind of, coming into their own. We might see some of those hopes and some of those visions in a positive way coming back too. And maybe that'll change the 60s in the way we remember them.
Well, that's a nice way to wrap up this episode. Thank you, Ben.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being here again on our podcast. We want to talk about a couple things that you're working on. You write a blog at the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. Can you talk about that just a little bit? We'll put a link to it on our webpage.
Yeah,
too.
This is the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. I always say is the only professional society that started as a blog. The blog actually began first, and the society grew out of it. And we're a professional society. We have an annual conference where members mainly academics, but we have a blog, and we'll put the web address on your website. And we have a team of bloggers. I was until last year the editor of it, but I rotated off, and now Laura Burnett is editing for us. She teaches down at Tarleton State in Texas. I was working actually on the 1980s right now, a book on Stanford in the 80s. So we deal all kinds of things about intellectual history and often the sort of intersection between it and events of the day. I blog every other day on Fridays. I hope I'm having something coming up today, though by the time this airs, today will be a long time ago, I think.
Every other week on Friday?
Every other week on Friday, yeah. Check it out. There's a lot of interesting material there about a lot of different subjects.
Cool. And your work is continuing on your book, Happy Days?
Work is continuing on my book, and I can't give you an ETA yet for the book, but I hope it's not too far away.
Well, thanks again, Ben.
And I did want to plug one other thing. I had an essay come out last month, actually, in a book called American Labyrinth, which is published by Cornell University Press. It's a collection of essays. It's kind of a sort of state of American intellectual history today. So, I mean, if that probably sounds to most people impossibly abstruse, but if it sounds interesting, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Quite beyond my essays about the relationship between cultural history and intellectual history, but it's very broad in its scope. And so, check that out.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. And we encourage listeners to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/Brainbox website and on social media by using hashtag BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. So this has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.